The German patrol saw them first through the morning fog. 3 figures standing perfectly still at the edge of the frozen forest, rifles raised, eyes open, watching the tree line like sentries who'd been carved from ice itself. Obergefreiter Klaus Brenner lowered his binoculars, his breath catching in his throat. Something was wrong. Terribly, impossibly wrong. They'd been standing there for 3 days, and they were dead. All 3 of them had been dead the entire time. What the Wehrmacht soldiers discovered that morning, January 28, 1944, in the forest outside Leningrad, would become one of the most disturbing mysteries of the Eastern Front. A phenomenon so bizarre that Soviet and German reports both documented it, yet neither could explain it. This is the story of the Frozen Sentinels of Volkhov, and the question that still haunts historians 80 years later. How do dead men stand guard? Let me take you back to that morning. Picture this, you're 19 years old, pressed into the Wehrmacht 3 months after your birthday. You've been marching through knee-deep snow for 6 hours, your feet are numb, and you haven't eaten anything hot in 2 days. The temperature is negative 32 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that your breath freezes in your mustache, cold enough that metal sticks to bare skin like glue. You're part of Heeresgruppe Nord, Army Group North, tasked with maintaining the siege of Leningrad. It's the longest, most brutal blockade in modern warfare, stretching into its 3rd winter. And every day out here, the forest tries to eliminate you just as efficiently as the Soviet bullets. Klaus Brenner knew this forest. He'd been patrolling these same frozen trails since December, watching for partisan activity, checking supply routes, recovering the frozen bodies of soldiers who'd gotten separated from their units and simply stopped. The cold out here didn't just end you, it preserved you, turned you into statues. But this was different. His squad had been tracking what they thought was a Soviet reconnaissance position. 3 scouts who'd been spotted 2 days earlier, observing German supply movements along the Volkhov River corridor. Standard protocol, locate them, neutralize the threat, move on. Except when they had advanced the previous morning, the scouts hadn't retreated, hadn't fired, hadn't moved at all. Brenner's commanding officer, Hauptmann Ernst Kohler, had assumed it was a trap, some kind of mannequin decoy designed to draw German fire and reveal their positions. So they'd waited, watched, set up observation posts with clear sightline. 24 hours passed, the 3 figures never moved, never shifted weight, never lowered their weapons. And now, on the morning of the 28th, Hauptmann Kohler had ordered a direct approach. Brenner's hands trembled as he gripped his Kar 98K rifle, not from cold, but from something else entirely. That primal instinct that warns you when you're about to see something that'll reshape your understanding of what's possible. They're not breathing, whispered Gefreiter Hans Richter, crouched beside him. Klaus, their faces. Look at their faces. Through the binoculars, Brenner could see what Richter meant. The 3 Soviet soldiers stood in a loose triangle formation, each one facing a different direction. Perfect overlapping fields of observation. The one in the center held a Mosin Nagant rifle at port arms. The one on the left had his weapon raised, sights aligned on the German position. The one on the right gripped an F1 grenade in his left hand, pin still attached. But their faces were blue, not the flushed red of exertion or the pale white of cold. Blue, the deep mottled blue of advanced frostbite and death. Their eyes were open, glazed with frost, staring at nothing. Hauptmann, Brenner called back to Kohler, his voice cracking. Hauptmann, I don't think they're alive. Kohler moved forward with 3 other soldiers, weapons raised, approaching the 3 Soviets in a wide flanking pattern. Standard clearing procedure, stay spread out, maintain multiple angles, watch for ambush for 50 meters. 30 meters and then, no movement, no reaction. And then Kohler reached out and touched the center soldier's shoulder. The body didn't fall. It swayed slightly, just a few centimeters, then settled back into position. Perfectly balanced, rigid as stone. Mein Gott, Kohler breathed, stepping back. They're frozen solid. Not just frozen, standing frozen, locked in position by temperatures so extreme that rigor mortis and ice had turned their bodies into biological statues. Their muscles had contracted in the final moments, their joints had seized, and the cold had preserved everything exactly as it had been when their hearts stopped beating. The question wasn't just how they'd passed. It was when and why they were still standing. To understand what happened to these 3 Soviet scouts, you need to understand the absolute nightmare of the Eastern Front in the winter of 1943 to 44. This wasn't war, as Hollywood shows it. This was industrial-scale destruction, mixed with environmental extremes that eliminated soldiers before they ever saw combat. The siege of Leningrad alone claimed over 1 million lives, not from bullets, but from starvation, disease, and cold. The Volkhov front, where our 3 scouts were operating, was a strategic corridor between German positions and the besieged city. Soviet forces had been conducting small unit reconnaissance operations throughout the winter, trying to identify German supply routes, ammunition depots, and weak points in the siege line. These weren't suicide missions exactly, but the survival rate was staggeringly low. Soviet scouts, Rozvedchiki, were elite troops, volunteers mostly, men who could navigate by the stars, who could survive for days on a handful of dried fish and black bread, who could infiltrate German lines so quietly that sentries never heard them coming. They operated in teams of 3 or 4, deep behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence that would inform larger Soviet offensive operations, and they did it in temperatures that would shut down modern armies. -30, -40 degrees Fahrenheit, sustained for weeks. At those temperatures, your body is fighting a constant battle just to stay alive. Your metabolism spikes. You need 4,000, 5,000 calories a day just to maintain core temperature. But Soviet scouts were rationed maybe 1,200. Their bodies were eating themselves from the inside, burning muscle tissue for fuel. Frostbite wasn't a risk, it was inevitable. The only question was how severe and whether you still have fingers and toes when you made it back to Soviet lines. If you made it back, Soviet doctrine emphasized mission completion above survival. Intelligence was more valuable than individual lives, a calculation that sounds brutal in hindsight, but made terrible strategic sense in the context of total war. If a 3-man scout team could identify a German ammunition depot, and that depot could be shelled and destroyed, potentially hundreds of Soviet soldiers' lives would be saved in future engagement. So scouts accepted a grim arithmetic, their lives in exchange for actionable intelligence. But here's what makes this story so deeply unsettling. These 3 scouts weren't discovered during their mission. They were discovered after, standing in formation, weapons ready, eyes open, like they'd been waiting for something. Hauptmann Kohler knew he had a problem. Standard protocol for encountering deceased Soviet soldiers was simple. Check for documents, intelligence materials, or anything of tactical value, then move on. The Eastern Front was littered with the frozen remains of soldiers from both sides. You learn to stop seeing them as people and start seeing them as terrain features. But this was different. Kohler ordered his men to establish a defensive perimeter while he examined the bodies more carefully. What he discovered in the next 20 minutes would be documented in his official field report, a report that would eventually make its way up the chain of command, be copied, translated, and filed away in Wehrmacht archives, where it would sit unread for decades. The center soldier, the one Kohler had touched, appeared to be the team leader, late 20s, maybe 30 years old. His uniform markings identified him as a starshina, a senior sergeant in the Red Army. His Mosin Nagant rifle was loaded, round-chambered, safety off, ready to fire. But his fingers were frozen around the rifle's stock in a death grip so tight that when one of Kohler's men tried to remove the weapon, the soldier's entire arm moved with it. The joints had locked, the tendons had frozen solid. The body had become a single rigid structure. The second soldier, positioned to the left, was younger, maybe 22, 23. He'd been aiming at something when he passed. His rifle was raised to his shoulder, eye aligned with the iron sights, finger inside the trigger guard, not on the trigger, inside the guard. One more pound of pressure, and the weapon would have fired. The third soldier on the right was the most disturbing. He was mid-throw. His right arm was cocked back, the F1 grenade gripped in his frozen hand. His left hand was extended forward, as if he'd been in the process of pulling the pin when the cold had stopped him. His mouth was open, jaw locked in what might have been a shout or a final breath, and his eyes were wide with an expression that Kohler later described in his report as alertness. Not fear, not pain. Alertness, like he'd seen something approaching. Kohler stepped back and looked at the 3 soldiers as a unit, and that's when the tactical picture snapped into focus. They were positioned in an overlapping security formation. Classic Soviet doctrine for static observation posts. The team leader in the center with the rifle at port arms, ready to engage threats from multiple directions. The designated marksman on the left with his rifle raised, covering the most likely avenue of approach. The grenadier on the right with his explosive, positioned to break contact if the position was overrun. This wasn't random. This wasn't 3 men who'd simply frozen to death during a patrol. They'd been maintaining a defensive position. But against what? Kola ordered his men to search the area 50 meters out, 100 meters, looking for tracks, shell casings, blood in the snow, anything that might explain what had happened. They found nothing. No sign of combat, no spent cartridges, no impact craters from grenades or artillery. And the snow around the 3 Soviets was pristine, except for the German patrol's own footprints. It was as if the 3 scouts had simply appeared in the forest, taken up defensive positions, and frozen solid before they could fire a shot. But Kola noticed something else, something that made the hair on his neck stand up despite the cold. The snow under the soldiers' boots was compressed, packed down, not fresh, meaning they'd been standing there in those exact positions for at least 2 days, possibly 3, long enough for subsequent snowfall to cover the area around them while the snow beneath their boots remained packed from their weight. They'd been standing there when they froze to death, not lying down, not curled up for warmth, not huddled together, standing at attention, weapons ready, like they'd been ordered to hold that position and had obeyed even as the cold shut down their bodies, cell by cell. The theories. So what actually happened? In the 80 years since this incident, historians, medical examiners, and military analysts have proposed half a dozen theories. Some are grounded in brutal physiological reality. Others venture into the realm of the inexplicable. Let's start with the science. Theory 1, cadaveric spasm. This is the most commonly accepted medical explanation, and it's as disturbing as it sounds. Cadaveric spasm, also called instantaneous rigor, is an extremely rare form of muscular stiffening that occurs at the moment of death. Unlike normal rigor mortis, which sets in gradually over several hours, cadaveric spasm is immediate. The muscles contract and lock within seconds, preserving whatever position the body was in when the heart stopped. It typically occurs under conditions of extreme physical or psychological stress. Drowning victims have been found with grass clutched in their hands, ripped from the riverbank in their final moments. Soldiers have been discovered with weapons death gripped so tightly that their fingers had to be broken to remove the guns. In the case of our 3 Soviet scouts, the theory goes like this. They'd been maintaining their observation post for days, operating at the absolute edge of human endurance, malnourished, exhausted, hypothermic. Their bodies were already shutting down, core temperature dropping, blood flow redirected away from extremities to protect vital organs, consciousness fading in and out. But they'd been trained to maintain their positions, drilled endlessly on the importance of completing the mission. So even as their bodies were failing, their discipline held. They stayed standing, stayed alert, stayed on watch. And when their hearts finally stopped, maybe within minutes of each other, maybe within seconds, their muscles locked in place instantly. The extreme cold then accelerated and preserved the process, turning their bodies into frozen statues before they could collapse. It's medically plausible, documented in other cases, explains the physical evidence, but it doesn't explain everything. Theory 2, hypothermic paradox. Here's where things get stranger. In the final stages of severe hypothermia, something bizarre happens. Your body, in a last desperate attempt to survive, dilates the blood vessels near your skin. Blood that's been restricted to your core suddenly floods back into your arms and legs, and you feel warm. Not actually warm. You're still freezing to death, but your brain interprets the sudden rush of blood as heat. This is why rescue teams sometimes find hypothermia victims partially undressed, and they've stripped off their clothes in the final minutes before death, convinced they were overheating. It's called paradoxical undressing, and it's one of the most eerie symptoms of end-stage cold exposure. But there's another, less documented effect, terminal burrowing. Victims in the final moments of hypothermia have been found in small, enclosed spaces, under beds, inside closets, curled up in corners, as if driven by some primal instinct to seek shelter. What if our 3 scouts experienced the opposite response? What if, in their hypothermic delirium, they believed they were under attack? What if their training was so deeply ingrained that even as their higher brain functions were shutting down, the part of their brain responsible for survival and combat response was still firing? They might have seen threats that weren't there, heard approaching enemies in the wind, convinced themselves that they were about to be overrun. And so they stood their ground, raised their weapons, prepared to defend themselves against phantoms until the cold claimed them. It would explain the defensive posture, the readiness, the expression on the grenadier's face. They'd been fighting to the very end, not against German, against hallucinations their dying brains had created. Theory 3, the order they couldn't disobey. Now we get into the darker possibilities. Soviet military discipline in World War II was legendary for its harshness. Blocking detachments, Zagradotriadi, were positioned behind Soviet lines with orders to shoot any soldier who retreated without permission. Order number 227, issued by Stalin himself in 1942, declared not one step back and authorized summary execution for cowardice or desertion. Soviet scouts operated under an even stricter code. They were given their mission, their observation position, and their recall time, and they were expected to maintain that position until recall, regardless of conditions, regardless of casualties, regardless of anything short of complete physical incapacitation. What if these 3 scouts had been ordered to hold this specific position for a specific duration? What if they'd been told that failure to do so would result in charges of desertion, not just against them, but against their family? Under those conditions, how long would you stay standing? How long before survival instinct overrode orders? For these 3 men, maybe it never did. Maybe they stayed at their post because leaving would have been unthinkable, because they'd been so thoroughly conditioned by Soviet military culture that abandoning their position, even to save their own lives, simply wasn't an option their minds could process. So they stood and watched and froze, obedient unto the end. Hauptmann Kohler's report made its way through Wehrmacht intelligence channels over the following weeks. It was noted, filed, and largely forgotten. The Eastern Front produced thousands of strange incidents every month: mass graves, partisan attacks, unexplained disappearances. 3 frozen Soviet scouts, barely registered as unusual in the larger context. But here's what makes this story remarkable. Soviet records mention them too. In March of 1944, a Red Army intelligence officer named Captain Dmitry Volkhov submitted a report documenting the loss of a 3-man reconnaissance team: Starshina Alexei Sokolov, Junior Sergeant Ivan Petrov, and Private Mikhail Krasnov, who'd failed to return from a deep penetration mission near the Volkhov River. The report noted that the team had been tasked with observing German supply movements for a 72-hour period beginning January 24, 1944. Their last radio contact had been on the evening of January 25th, when Sokolov reported that they'd established an observation post and were settling in for extended watch. They were never heard from again. Captain Volkov's report included a curious addendum. A German prisoner captured during a skirmish in early February had mentioned encountering 3 frozen Soviet soldiers in the forest. When questioned, he described their positions, their equipment, and their location. It matched Sokolov's team perfectly. Volkhov requested permission to conduct a recovery operation, but by that point, Soviet forces were preparing for a major offensive. Individual casualties, even ones as unusual as this, were deemed secondary to operational priorities. The 3 frozen scouts were left where they stood. And here's the haunting part. Multiple German patrols reported seeing them over the following weeks, always in the same position, always standing, eyes open, weapons raised. Some soldiers swore they could see frost forming on the scouts' eyelashes. Others claimed that the bodies swayed slightly in strong winds, but never fell. By March, when Soviet forces finally pushed German units back from that sector, the 3 scouts had become something of a grim landmark. German troops referred to them as die Eiswachter, the ice sentries. Soviet soldiers called them Zammershir Strazzi, the frozen guardians. When Soviet forces retook the area in late March 1944, recovery teams were sent to retrieve the bodies. According to the recovery report, filed on March 28th, exactly 2 months after they'd first been spotted, the 3 scouts were still standing, still in formation, still frozen solid, despite weeks of slightly warmer temperatures. It took 6 men with ropes and poles to topple them. The bodies didn't bend. They fell like trees, rigid and intact. They were transported back to Soviet lines and, according to military records, buried with honors near Leningrad. But the exact location of their graves has never been confirmed. No markers, no memorial. Just a footnote in the vast tragedy of the Eastern Front. So what do we take from this? Is it a story about the limits of human endurance? About discipline carried to its fatal extreme? About the psychological toll of warfare and environments that make survival itself a daily battle? Maybe it's all of those things. Or maybe it's something simpler. Something that every soldier who's ever served in winter warfare understands instinctively. The cold doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care about your mission, your training, or your orders. It just takes, methodically, 1 degree at a time. And if you're not careful, if you push just a little too far, stay out just a little too long, ignore the warning signs that your body is shutting down, it'll turn you into a monument to your own stubbornness. That's what happened to Starshina Alexei Sokolov, Junior Sergeant Ivan Petrov, and Private Mikhail Krasnov. They were good soldiers. They followed their orders. They maintained their position. And the cold turned them into legends. Today, if you dig through Wehrmacht field reports and Soviet military archives, you can still find references to the Frozen Sentinels of Volkhov. Footnotes mostly. Brief mentions in larger documents about winter warfare conditions on the Eastern Front. But for the soldiers who saw them, both German and Soviet, the memory lasted a lifetime. Klaus Brenner, the young Wehrmacht soldier who'd first spotted them through his binoculars, survived the war. He returned to Germany, married, raised a family, and in the 1970s, he gave an interview to a military historian researching unusual incidents from the Eastern Front. When asked about the strangest thing he'd witnessed during the war, Brenner didn't hesitate. The 3 Russians in the forest, he said, standing there like they were still on duty, like they didn't know they were dead. That image, it never left me. 80 years later, I can still see their faces, still see that soldier with the grenade frozen mid-throat. And I still wonder, what were they seeing in those final moments? What did they think they were defending against? We'll never know. But on cold winter nights, when the wind howls through the forests outside what used to be Leningrad, locals say you can still feel their presence. 3 shadows in the snow, 3 watchers in the dark, standing guard over a war that ended decades ago, still waiting for orders that will never come, still frozen at the moment between duty and death. The Eastern Front claimed 27 million Soviet lives and 4 million German lives. Most died from bullets, shells, and bombs, but thousands more, maybe tens of thousands of them, simply froze, alone in the snow, far from home. And some of them, like our 3 scouts, died standing up. If you found this story as haunting as I did, let me know in the comments. And if you know of other mysteries from the Eastern Front that deserve to be told, I'm listening. Because history isn't just about the battles we remember. It's about the soldiers we forgot, the ones who are still standing in the snow long after the war ended.